we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 2nd of June of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about talks about the second round of the negotiations that took place on the territory of Istanbul. Probably somebody expected that the Russians would not send their delegation there, but the Russians sent their delegation, and according to information we have, this is exactly the moment when the Russian delegation arrived on the territory of Istanbul. According to information we have, the Ukrainians sent their own delegation as well, and when talking about the Ukrainian side, before the beginning of talks, they published their memorandum. So this is the document that you can find in the internet, and here we can see more or less detailed explanation of what exactly the Ukrainians are planning to get, want to achieve from these talks and from the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Just a few words, short words about the situation. Western media published the full version of the Ukrainian ceasefire memorandum, prisoner exchange all for all, discussion of guarantees to prevent a new conflict, security guarantees for Ukraine. The line of combat contact becomes the starting point of negotiations, but Kiev does not recognize the lost territories, and neither in the world. Parts of the sanctions against Russia may be lifted, frozen assets will be used for the restoration of Ukraine and for something like contribution. Meeting of leaders with the possible participation of the US and the European Union to clarify the details of the agreement. A 30-day ceasefire with the possibility of extension. So telling the truth, when talking about these documents, the Ukrainians hasn't demanded anything special or anything new. We are familiar with these requirements and we know them, we knew them probably 3 or 4 months ago. So the meeting started, and this is exactly the video of the first seconds of this meeting. There are several interesting differences in comparison with the previous meeting. If you take a look at this video, we can see that the Russians came in suits. When talking about Ukrainians, they came in military uniform. So this is something like a message, silent message, that Ukrainians, after the situation that took place yesterday, are ready to continue war, are ready to continue the special military operation. And then the meeting started. Russia and Ukraine exchanged documents on the settlement at the talks in Istanbul and are preparing a new release of prisoners. That was stated by Zelensky. They exchanged documents through the Turkish side, and we are preparing a new release of prisoners. But later we got additional details about the meeting, and telling the truth, so we haven't seen anything special. Russia and Ukraine's talks in Istanbul have ended. They lasted more than 1 hour. So that was stated by different media, but today we got additional details. The head of Ukrainian delegation, Ustem Umerov, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, he missed the meeting for 40 minutes. So let's say that the meeting, took place around, 1 hour and 20 minutes. Of this 1 hour and 20 minutes, there were no head of Ukrainian delegation, the Minister of Defense. So basically this meeting was very short, somewhere around 30 minutes, not more. Moscow and Kiev were supposed to discuss the terms of a ceasefire, the condition of the exchange of prisoners and arrested civilians, as well as a possible meeting between the two presidents and the second round of talks. Later we got reports that no major breakthrough, just minor steps. The Financial Times cites a senior Ukrainian official. It looks like they are playing out diplomacy for Trump, he says. The two delegations did not shake hands or make any offers that could indicate progress on any potential deal. The newspaper writes, Russia did not agree to a ceasefire and a meeting of leaders. We only agreed on prisoner exchange, the head of the Ukrainian delegation. Let's discuss these statements in detail. Head of Ukrainian delegation, Umerov, spoke about the results of the negotiations. Details: Ukraine and Russia have agreed to exchange all seriously ill prisoners of war and persons under the age of 25. Russia did not agree to a ceasefire and a meeting of leaders. We only agreed on an exchange of prisoners. So, which means that most likely during the next several days, the Russians will try to strike back after the situation that took place yesterday. Furthermore, we still haven't received any comment from the United States of America, because under the guarantees of the United States of America, Ukrainians destroyed several strategical bombers of the armed force of the Russian Federation and attacked several strategical airfields. We still haven't received anything from the United States of America. They haven't made any comment, but obviously obviously today they had very tough talks with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, because Zelensky basically violated the guarantees that were provided by the United States of America. So as for now, nothing special, just all these talks and rumors. Anyway, let's wait for several days because most likely something huge is going to happen. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Sumy direction. Probably the most important piece of news is that the Russians managed to restore the railways. I'll remind you that yesterday, as a result of terrorist attack, the bridge fell down on the railways, and as a result of this attack, there were lots of casualties among civilians. But as you can see, it required just 24 hours for the Russians to restore this railway, which means that the Russians haven't lost anything in their logistic and supply and supporting of their forces in the Sumy direction.
I dag, der skal ud og køre i den her folkevogn ID3.
Volkswagen ID3 er en familiebil i mellemklassen.
And telling the truth, the Russians didn't stop. The Russians continue offensive operation. And during the first 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. So this is the map that you can see right now in front of your screens. Is the situation by the end of the 2nd of June of 2025. So as you can see, the Russians improved their positions, and this is the situation by the end of the 1st of June. So as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to take under complete control the village by the name of Kondratovka. So as for the end of the 2nd of June, this information was just confirmed by several mappers without any proofs with geolocation or with video. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Andreevka. So this is the situation by the end of this 2nd of June. The village of Kondratovka was taken. Most likely tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or maybe this evening, the group of forces north will confirm this information. As for the settlement of Andreevka, here we can see the video that was published by the Ukrainian side, and here we can see how Ukrainians of the 103rd Territory Defense Brigade were attacking Russian vehicles, equipment, soldiers in these fields in this area in the vicinity of Andreevka with FPV drones. So one of the episodes was geolocated exactly in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. So this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the moment Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers in these fields. Based on this video we have adjusted the map by adding these three lines under complete control of Russia. Most likely currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Andreevka, and most likely tomorrow this village would be colored in Russian favor as well. Furthermore, today we got reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions in Nikolaevka, Nikolaevka, and that the settlement was also taken by the Russians. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back. As you can see, the Ukrainians are not able to hold their lines. They're retreating. They're getting back and back, and the Ukrainians probably are trying to save their soldiers, and Ukrainians most likely are going to show a more or less tough resistance to the armored force of the Russian Federation on the territory of these huge forests. Basically, they can't do anywhere else this because there are no strongholds. The Ukrainians haven't managed to create the strongholds along the first defense belt. But the main problem for the Ukrainians is that most likely the Russians are not going to attack the forest itself. Most likely the forest would be outflanked from the west and the northwest. But anyway, the Russians continue offensive, and today we got another geolocation in between Loknya, Belovody, Yunakiivka, Yablunovka. Here we can see FPV drone attack on Russian positions. Ukrainians published this video, and this attack took place exactly in this point. Based on this video we have adjusted the map. So now we see that the Russians managed to cut most likely the village of Yunakiivka from supply when talking about N07 road, because currently the distance between Russia's H positions and Ukrainian road is less than 1 kilometer. So we believe that there are already sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armored force of the Russian Federation. So during the next 48-72 hours, we expect that Ukrainians would be forced to completely abandon their positions in this area, and the first defense line will be taken by the Russians. And as we can see, according to the current situation, according to updates we are receiving, without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, because obviously it is very important what the Russians are going to do next. as soon as they get the forest. Either they're going to outflank the forest from the north and the northwest, or the Russians would decide to move further deep inside of the forest and to move through this area to get as close as possible to the city of Sumy. Anyway, this is a very important question because everything depends on this. The most important time. The Russians, despite the fact that the Russians are advancing and the Russian offensive is gaining momentum, the Russians are limited in their time. They have just 3 months of summer offensive operation, and telling the truth, if the Russians answer the forest, they can spend these 3 months just for clashes for this area. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions in the city of Volchansk itself. Several blocks were taken by the Russians as a result of offensive operation. At least this information was confirmed by different mappers. This is the situation by the end of the 2nd of June of 2025. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their activities and their strikes on Ukrainian positions in the area of Ovchansky Hutory and Pokolyane. So the Russians are bombing and attacking this territory. Maybe the Russians are planning to cross the river of Volchansk exactly in this area with the purpose to begin the battle for the southern part of the settlement. When talking about the northeastern part of Kharkiv region and the entire Kupiansk, northern Kupiansk direction, during the first 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just the regular activities. The only important video we got is the video from the city of Kupiansk itself. As you can see, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the settlement with FABs, and another temporary deployment point, most likely if the FPV drone operators, was destroyed.
Jeg hedder Trine Terkelsen, og jeg synes, at du skal gå ind og høre playlisten Godnatsange. Der har jeg nogle af mine fortolkninger.
When talking about the entire Kupiansk direction, the most interesting updates are coming from the southern Kupiansk direction or the Liman direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. The Russians took under control these three lines, the eastern part of the village of Karpovka, the river of Nitrius itself, the northern part, and the Russians managed to land infantry on the western bank of the river of Nitrius on the western part of the village of Karpovka. Telling the truth, I didn't expect that the Russians were able to do this because I expected that the Russians from the village of Redka-Dub would continue offensive operation further in the southwestern direction until they get the river of Nitrius. And from this moment, I expected that the Russians would move along the river of Nitrius in the southern direction with the purpose to attack the village of Shandrigalovo. But now we see that something changed in the Russians' plans. Maybe the Ukrainians didn't show any resistance. Maybe the Ukrainians maybe the Russians just decided to try their luck and to move further, and according to geolocations we see that the Russians crossed the river of Nitrius and managed to establish control over several constructions and buildings on the Ukrainian side. We have proofs, and this is very important. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in this area, how Ukrainians were trying to destroy Russian drones, how Ukrainians were attacking positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation on the territory of this settlement, so which means that the Russians improved their positions, and this is obviously a very significant improvement. Now it's a very interesting question what the Russians are going to do next, because now, as I understand, the Russians have several options. The first one, as we discussed a minute ago, to move along the river of Nitrius on the eastern side of the river in the southern direction towards the settlement of Shandrigalovo. The Russians can do the same, but on the Ukrainian side of the same river in the direction of Serednye, and then further in the southern direction towards the settlement of Novoselka. So the Russians can move along the river of Nitrius on both sides, from the north, from the west, and from the east. But at the same time, now the Russians have possibilities to move further in the western direction towards the settlement of Vavchi Yar and then towards the settlement of Lazova. This will allow the Russians to establish complete control over the to get the river of Oskol from the south, from the southern part of this river, and basically to cut the Barovo direction from supply and support. When talking about the Barovo direction, this is the area between the settlements of Boguslavka, the settlement of Novosergeyevka, Chernyshina, and the settlement of Lazova. So we are talking about this pocket. If the Russians are able to take under control the settlement of Lazova, this is going to be the situation when the Ukrainians would be completely cut from supply and support from the mainland. Of course, Ukrainians will have some bridges, some roads between Barova and Ukrainian side, but the river of Oskol is not a perfect situation to supply forces on this side of the river Oskol. We're not saying that the river Oskol is something like impossible barrier for supply and support. And furthermore, I'll remind you that several dams in the vicinity of Oskol were destroyed. So now the river that you can see right now in front of your screen is not the same river as we have right now, because there are less water and Ukrainians has less problems to supply their forces. But obviously this is going to be very difficult, because now the Ukrainians' main roads of supply and support go from the south, from the settlement of Oskol, from the northern direction through the village of Pisky-Ritkovsky, Nizhe Salona, and then further in the direction of Barova. So the Russians can cut this supply line and then to handle with every single piece of the Kupiansk direction separately, with the northern Kupiansk direction, with the central Kupiansk direction, and with the Liman direction. So now let's move further. As for the Sivers direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got several icons. How the Russians continue their hunting operation. They were hunting, attacking, and destroying Ukrainian vehicles among these brushes, tree lines, and fields, but without any changes on the ground. So this is the regular pattern for the Russians in this area. First, they bomb this territory for another 1 or 2 weeks, and then they improve their positions just for several square kilometers. And this is how the Russians are moving and have been moving since the settlement of Lysychansk in the western direction. But anyway, the Russians crossed the 50% of the territory, and now the Russians are about to begin offensive in Sivers, but due to this pace, the Russians most likely will start this not very soon. When talking about the settlement of Konstantinovka, the Russians continue their offensive, and during the past 24 hours, according to different sources, the Russians improved their positions in the northern direction from the city of Chasavyar, taking under control additional mines and fortifications in the fields. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers and by pro-Russian resources. So let's compare the changes. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 1st of June of 2025. These positions considered as the positions under complete Ukrainian control, and this is the situation by the end of the 2nd of June. The Russians continue offensive, and as we discussed in the previous videos, most likely the Russians will try to take under control the settlements of Mayskaya, Markova, Novomarkova, all these areas, with the purpose to have better positions, better possibilities, and better places for massing their troops in this area. The Russians need additional positions on the Ukrainian side of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal to mass their troops. This will allow the Russians to carry out very powerful offensive operation in the direction of Drushkovka. If the Russians somehow are able to carry out this offensive operation to break through Ukrainian defense and to get and to shorten the distance for as close as possible to this road N20 and the settlement of Drushkovka, this can lead to complete collapse and full encirclement of the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of Konstantinovka. It's very hard to believe in this maneuver, but everything is possible, you know this. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions in the city of Chasavyar. Several pro-Russian resources report about this. We are waiting for additional updates and additional proofs. When talking about the Kliban-Byksky pocket during the previous 24 hours, the main updates we got from the southern part of the pocket, from the settlement of Zarya. Today Russians published this video, and here we can see several episodes and several places where Russian soldiers raised the Russian flags. The first episode took place in the central part, the next one took place in the northwestern part of the village. Based on this video we have adjusted the map, but not the entire village. So basically today, during the 2nd of June, we've colored everything that yesterday were considered as a contested area. So this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 1st of June, and basically based on the geolocations we got today, we just colored these territories. Today we got additional statements from different mappers, neutral mappers, and pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians established complete control over the territory of Zarya. As for the end of the 2nd of June of 2025, we haven't received neither another confirmation from the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, or at least any video published by the Russian or Ukrainian side that can confirm complete control over this settlement. So as for now, we believe that there are still very heavy clashes in the northern part, especially for these farms that are located to the northwest of Romanovka, northeast of Zarya. So, but it's just a matter of time, it's just a matter of several days, and then the Russians would continue moving further. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the eastern part of Yablunovka. The Russians are attacking this settlement to the north of these water reservoirs and the lake, and to the south, trying to move at the same time from the northern part and on the southern part of the settlement. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of videos that confirm Russian control over the most western part of the settlement, and several videos that confirm the Ukrainian presence in the western part. But we see that as a result of Russian attacks, Ukrainians suffer losses every day, and they are forced to fall back further and further in the eastern direction. But once again, according to a video we got from Istanbul, we see that Ukrainians are ready to fight more. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of Shevchenko-Persha. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers. As for the city of Pokrovsk, we haven't received anything for a very long period of time. And telling the truth, this becomes very interesting because the operational pause in this area is already last for probably 4 or 5 weeks. We haven't received anything during this period of time, just artillery strikes, some flamethrowers attacks, but nothing more. So we don't know for sure what is happening right now in the city of Pokrovsk, but we understand that the city of Pokrovsk is the focal point of Russian summer offensive operation, at the same time with the city of Konstantinovka, Siversk and Liman. But we don't have anything here. So most likely the Russians on the western flank of the city of Pokrovsk are waiting for how the situation is going to be developed in the area of Konstantinovka. So everything depends on this situation. As soon as the Russians are able to resolve issues around the city of Konstantinovka, we should expect the resuming of Russian offensive as well. As for the South Donetsk direction and the Gulay-Polye direction, during the previous 24 hours, nothing special. The only interesting video we got from the village of Terminovka. Here we can see how the Russians established complete fire control over the main supply lines that go in the direction of the settlement. The Russians were bombing and attacking this territory. So due to this video, we expect the additional changes on the ground in the direction of Timirovka in Russian favor. So the Russians are going to continue offensive despite the situation in this area. When talking about the city of Gulay-Polye, as we discussed, this is the next target for the Russians. Since the second part of May, and we have seen lots of videos how the Russians were bombing the settlement on the perimeter of the settlement to the west and to the east. So we expect additional changes in this area as well. Probably the Russians will try to attack the village of Gulay-Polye, the city of Gulay-Polye, during Russian progress on the ground from the northeastern direction. And that's it for today.